It's almost like deja vu. Handsome, intelligent, highly educated, and methodical. Words that once described Ted Bundy, now eerily whispered about Bryan Kohberger. Two men, separated by decades, yet bound by chilling parallels. College towns haunted by brutal murders, campuses gripped by fear, and a nation fixated on these crimes. But could Kohberger, a criminal justice PhD student obsessed with the darkest minds in criminal history, have deliberately stepped into Bundy's sinister shadow? Let's explore the unsettling possibility of a copycat killer, one who may have studied history's most notorious predator so closely he wanted to become him. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you've never been here before, I am Kimberlea. It's nice to finally meet you. And if you are new, I have a true crime channel here on YouTube where I talk about solved cases in a narrative format, as well as a podcast with my husband called Dark Livity. So if you are new and interested in that type of content, I will leave the links below. But on this channel, I discuss current and ongoing cases as well as trials that are happening right now, and I break down the legal aspects in an easy to understand manner because I am currently studying for my bar exam. I have a law degree and a degree in psychology and sociology, but if you want to know more about me and why you should listen to me, you can look below in the description box and understand my education and my background, because that is the lens in which I view the world in cases like this. Recently, there was a Dateline episode talking about the Idaho case, and specifically Bryan Kohberger. We now know this was leaked information, and that information is what I'm using to do some of these comparisons. All the claims about Bryan Kohberger remain allegations as he awaits his trial, whereas Bundy's are drawn from established facts after conviction. But during that episode, we came to find out that there were searches made on Bryan Kohberger's phone allegedly that included a supposed obsession, as they put it, with Ted Bundy, which is why I want to dive into all of this. I'll be talking about both Ted and Bryan's backgrounds, then their psychological profiles, followed by their relationships with women, their criminal trajectory and methods, their media portrayal, and the public and legal responses to their crimes or alleged crimes. So let's begin. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th of 1946. Bundy had a tumultuous early life. He was raised for a time believing that his mother was actually his sister. His unwed mother, Louise Cowell, initially passed him off as her younger brother to avoid stigma. As a toddler, Bundy exhibited really odd behaviors. An aunt once awoke to find the 3-year-old placing knives around her sleeping body. Family dynamics were fraught. His grandfather was described as ill-tempered, a violent man who may even have been Bundy's biological father. After Louise moved with young Theodore to Washington and married Johnny Bundy, Ted resented his stepfather's modest income and intellect, often acting out and provoking him. Socially, Ted Bundy was awkward. He struggled to fit in, and childhood peers recalled that he even had a speech impediment and lagged behind in activities like the Boy Scouts. Despite these early difficulties, Bundy was intelligent. He graduated from the University of Washington with a psychology degree in 1972 and even worked in politics, receiving a glowing recommendation from the governor after volunteering on a campaign. He attended law school in Utah, although he never completed it, and during college, Bundy did have a serious girlfriend. She's often referred to as Diane, and she came from a wealthy background. Their breakup devastated him, and many of Bundy's later female victims actually resembled this ex, attractive young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. Now, Bryan Kohberger was born on November 21st of 1994, so both he and Ted were born in November, only a few days from each other, which I believe could be significant to this case, but I'll get into that later. Bryan Kohberger grew up in a rural part of Pennsylvania's Pocono Mountains, in which seemed like an ordinary family. He was the youngest child with 2 older sisters, raised by parents who worked for the local school district. In adolescence, Bryan Kohberger faced social challenges. He was heavy and he was bullied for it, which apparently took a toll on his self-esteem. Classmates described him as an awkward teenager who struggled to fit in. As he was trying to seek acceptance and to fit in, he fell in with the drug-using crowd. That started with marijuana, and it eventually escalated to a heroin addiction in high school, leading him to drop out for rehab. During his later teen years, Bryan Kohberger underwent a dramatic transformation. He lost a considerable amount of weight. Now, it has been said that he even went under surgery to remove excess skin from his body. I did not see any scars, not that I've examined Bryan Kohberger in a way that would showcase that. But when this weight loss occurred, his personality shifted. Friends recall that after losing weight, he became more aggressive and domineering. He always wanted to be dominant physically and intellectually, they said. Despite these troubles, Bryan refocused on his academics after overcoming his addiction. He earned an associate's degree at a local community college and then a bachelor's in psychology. He demonstrated a strong curiosity about the human mind. And in 2022, he obtained a master's degree in criminal justice from DeSales University in Pennsylvania, where he studied under the famed forensic psychologist Katherine Ramsland. She is an expert on the serial killer BTK, among others. At the time of the crimes that he was accused of, Bryan Kohberger was pursuing a PhD in criminology at Washington State University. This was just a few miles across state lines from the University of Idaho. His peers described him as quiet, intelligent, and somewhat of a loner. Now I want to get into the psychological profiles, and we're going to start with Ted Bundy. Psychological experts characterize Bundy overwhelmingly as exhibiting the traits of a classic psychopath. In fact, during his Florida murder trial, renowned psychiatrist Dr. Hervey Klenke, the author of The Mask of Sanity, interviewed Ted Bundy and diagnosed him as a psychopath, a diagnosis that was later corroborated by other experts. And this meant that Bundy was a social predator who could charm and manipulate without conscience or remorse. Bundy was known for his superficial charisma and his calm demeanor under pressure, traits that helped him live a double life as an upstanding student and boyfriend by day and a predator by night. According to psychologist Dr. Thomas Whitaker, Bundy was emotionally stable in the clinical sense, which means he was low in neuroticism, which enabled his calculated deceit. He also analyzed Bundy's personality through a trait model and noted he was highly antagonistic, deceptive, callous, exploitative, and arrogant. Extroverted when it served him, charming, assertive, surprisingly conscientious, organized, and methodical in planning his crimes, and notably, low in anxiety or guilt. Beyond psychopathology, Bundy showed evidence of other disorders. He had pronounced sadistic tendencies and engaged in necrophilia. That's violating the bodies of victims after they are already deceased. Per forensic assessments, Bundy's ability to compartmentalize was chilling. He could brutally murder strangers and then return to his normal life without any signs of distress, at least outwardly. Bundy himself maintained that he felt no genuine guilt for his crimes, even near the end, only feigning remorse in a last-ditch effort to delay his execution. Psychiatrists like Dorothy O. Lewis, who evaluated Bundy, have theorized that his behavior stemmed from early trauma and possible childhood abuse, noting that his bizarre early actions like the knife incident as a toddler are seen, quote, only in very seriously traumatized children, end quote. In summary, Bundy's psychological profile is one of extreme antisocial personality disorder, a narcissistic psychopath with the ability to mask his utter lack of empathy behind a veneer of all-American charm. And now on to Bryan Kohberger. Unlike Bundy, Bryan Kohberger has not, as of yet, been publicly diagnosed by professionals except for what's been released in the motions recently and in documentation in the court regarding both autism spectrum disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. But emerging information paints a picture of a troubled psyche. In his teenage years, Kohberger himself described experiencing alarming mental and emotional states. In online forum posts attributed to him by investigators between 2009 and 2011, a teen believed to be Kohberger wrote that he felt, quote, no emotion and little remorse, end quote. And this was him as a youth. This is what he was saying he felt like. He spoke of things like crazy thoughts and delusions of grandeur, along with profound depersonalization, feelings as if he were observing life as a video game, unable to connect emotionally to others. And he said, quote, "I can say and do whatever I want with little remorse," end quote. He allegedly wrote this in 2011, and these self-confessed feelings of detachment and lack of empathy have led some commenters to suggest that Bryan Kohberger could have psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies, even though no formal evaluation has been released yet. What is known from acquaintances is that after years of being bullied, Kohberger's personality flipped in late adolescence. He became arrogant, manipulative, and aggressive. A former friend recounts that Kohberger, quote, "had to show that he was smarter and bigger than you and put others down to better himself," end quote. He reportedly craved dominance, a desire to be an alpha, even engaging in unwanted physical grappling with peers as it were a game of supremacy. Such behaviors hint at narcissistic and antisocial traits, an inability to tolerate not being in control or not being respected. Kohberger's intense interest in criminal psychology also stands out. He studied the minds of criminals academically and even sought to work in law enforcement, applying for an internship at a local police department, which we will get to. It's speculated that he may have been driven by a dark curiosity or sense of intellectual pride, maybe even hubris to think that he could outsmart the system. In fact, some law enforcement sources have theorized that Bryan Kohberger might have been attempting the perfect crime, given his criminology background. While it remains to be seen what psychological profile that courts or experts might eventually ascribe to, early clues suggest a personality marked by social isolation, anger, and potentially a lack of empathy, a mix that, in a few cases like Bundy's, has preceded violent behavior. Now let's talk about the relationships with women. Ted Bundy's relationships with women were paradoxical. On the surface, he could appear caring and romantic. He maintained a long-term relationship with Elizabeth Glover, a single mom he met in 1969, for about 6 years. Elizabeth later recalled Bundy as attentive and loving in their day-to-day life. She had no idea that he was secretly killing women during much of their time together. Then Bundy was even briefly married. During his Florida trial in 1980, he famously proposed to his friend Carol Ann Boone in open court and married her on the spot, taking advantage of the Florida law recognizing courtroom declarations as a legal marriage. Boone stayed convinced of his innocence for years. She even had a daughter with Bundy in 1982 and only divorced him once his guilt became undeniable. These normal relationships show how superficially charming and convincing Bundy could be with women that he wanted to deceive. However, Bundy's violent misogyny was at the core of all of his crimes. He specifically targeted young women, often college students, who he found attractive. And as noted, many of them had long dark hair resembling his college girlfriend who had dumped him. Investigators and Bundy's own statements suggest he harbored intense resentment and anger towards women in general. He raped many female victims, objectifying and brutalizing them in the most extreme ways, and continued to violate their corpses, indicating an utter lack of respect for the female victims beyond them being objects for his gratification. In conversations on death row, Bundy at times blamed his crimes on an addiction to violent pornography, a claim that to some experts was a deflection of his own hatred towards women. Psychiatrists like Dr. Dorothy Lewis have actually said that Bundy's homicidal rage was part of an expression of deeply buried anger stemming from feelings of abandonment by the women in his life. His mother's early deception about not being his real mom, the breakup with his ex-girlfriend, even in non-lethal interactions, Bundy was manipulative with women. For instance, after his arrest, he dangled hints about additional female victims to law enforcement as a way to extend his own life. He was using the fates of women's bodies as a bargaining chip for that delay. While Bundy could charm women on a personal level enough to have girlfriends and even admirers, his underlying view of them seemed to be as prey. He as a predator, controlling the relationships with women fueled by misogynistic urges to dominate and destroy those who attracted him. And now let's talk about Bryan Kohberger. His interactions with and the attitudes towards women appear to have been troubled. Unlike Bundy, though, Kohberger did not have any known long-term romantic relationships. Former classmates and acquaintances suggest that he often struggled socially, especially with women. In college settings, he could come off as condescending or even inappropriate towards female peers, and one anonymous graduate classmate noted that Kohberger often adopted a contrarian and argumentative tone in seminars, that he clashed more with female students. And in one instance, a female doctoral student stormed out after accusing him of mansplaining during class. Now, this pattern hints at underlying misogynistic or at least sexist attitudes. There are also reports that Kohberger was outright creepy towards women, even when it was just a casual encounter. Back in Pennsylvania, the owner of a brewery that Kohberger frequented recalled that he would sit alone just watching women, and then he would intrusively ask female patrons or staff who they were with and where they lived. If these women didn't respond to his questions, he would get irritated and aggressive in his tone. The behavior became so concerning that the bar's staff put a note in their system warning that Kohberger made creepy comments and tended to get a little too comfortable after a few drinks. On one occasion, the owner had to pull him aside and warn him to show respect to the female staff and patrons. Bryan Kohberger reacted by becoming defensive and claiming not to know what the owner was referring to. Now, this inability to accept rejection or criticism, especially from women, suggests a grievance or entitlement mindset. And some have speculated that Kohberger may identify as being an incel, involuntary celibacy. And there is a subculture online, especially young men who resent women for romantically or sexually rejecting them, although definitive evidence of this is limited to his documented social struggles. What is known from the investigation is that Kohberger appeared to fixate on at least one of his female victims. Investigators found multiple photos of one of the slain University of Idaho women on Kohberger's phone. Now, disclaimer, I found that information on people.com just this month, and this is what was said. Quote, additionally, the affidavit alleged a cell phone associated with Kohberger pinged in the area of 1122 King Road on at least 12 occasions prior to November 13th of 2022, end quote. A source familiar with the investigation told People that Kohberger also had photos of one of the female victims on his phone. They did not specify whether the images were taken by Kohberger or pulled from social media. Quote, he had more than one picture of her. End quote. This is what a source said to People. And I have to wonder if this is the same source that leaked the information to Dateline. I don't know, but this is what I've read. It also said, quote, it was clear that he was paying attention to her, end quote. And I'm assuming this is Maddie Mogan, who was allegedly his intended victim. Now, I could get into why I think this could be true, meaning what characteristics she had that I believe could have been why she was chosen, if that was the case, but I don't want to lose focus on the topic at hand, so maybe in another video. But sources say that Bryan had DM'd one of the victims repeatedly on Instagram, apparently becoming frustrated when she did not respond to his messages. This was also reported on People.com. The article said, quote, 2 weeks before the students were killed, Kohberger sent a series of messages to one of the victims on Instagram. An investigator familiar with the case told People he slid into one of the girl's DMs several times, but she didn't respond, end quote. Again, that was from a source. Same one that leaked to Dateline? I don't know. But this is what was said, quote, basically, it was just him saying, hey, how are you? But he did it again and again, end quote. The source added that the victim may have not even seen the messages as they went into the request folder on Instagram. And they said, quote, there's no indication that he was getting frustrated with her lack of response, but he was definitely persistent. So what is being said here is that no, he wasn't yelling, no, he wasn't cussing, no, he wasn't saying anything in those texts or DMs that would make anyone believe that he was frustrated, but this is all speculated. He even allegedly visited the restaurant where two of the victims worked. This was the Mad Greek restaurant, as if he were scouting or attempting to encounter them. This pattern of stalking and the contact he was making suggests an obsessive interest that turned deadly. Kohberger's relationship with women seemed defined by social failure, possible resentment, and inappropriate attempts to impose himself, a dynamic that, if he is guilty of the Idaho murders, escalated into the ultimate act of violence against the young women who had unknowingly become objects of his wrath. Now let's discuss the criminal trajectory, and we'll start with Ted Bundy. Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, and his criminal trajectory was marked by a series of escalating violent attacks across multiple states in the 1970s. It's believed that Bundy began murdering women around 1974 at age 27, although some experts suggest he started earlier, even in his teens. He ultimately confessed to killing 30 women. But investigators believe that the true number of victims may be much higher, potentially over 100. Bundy's modus operandi, or his MO, was cunning and calculated. He often preyed on young women in vulnerable moments, for example, late at night in a deserted parking lot or dimly lit campuses. A hallmark of his method was deception. Bundy would feign injury or impersonate authority to lure his victims in, and in several famous instances, he wore a sling or a cast on his arm and pretended to struggle with books or packages, counting on women's empathy to help him carry them to his car. And once near his Volkswagen Beetle, he would bludgeon them until they were unconscious and handcuff them or restrain them. In another case, he posed as a police officer to lure a victim into his vehicle, as with Carol DeRanch, who narrowly escaped. And Bundy was highly mobile and organized, meaning he killed in at least 6 different states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida, often switching locations to avoid detection. Now, if you're pinpointing Idaho, it is interesting, right? Because there's speculation that Bryan Kohberger might have been starting in Idaho, but planned to continue his spree. We'll talk about that in a moment. Once Bundy had overpowered a victim, the actual killing was brutal. He favored bludgeoning his victims with a heavy object or strangling them to death. Many victims were also sexually assaulted, and Bundy's crimes were marked by extraordinary violence and even depraved post-mortem acts, like he visited the dump sites of his victims to perform sexual acts on them on their decomposing bodies, a fact that he admitted in his final confessions, revealing his necrophilia urges. Bundy, for a long time, extraordinarily successful at avoiding capture, in part because serial killer profiling and DNA forensics were in their infancy in the 70s. However, as his confidence grew, so did his boldness. In a single day in July of 1974, he brazenly abducted 2 women in broad daylight from a crowded park in Washington. This was an act which produced eyewitness descriptions of a handsome young man named Ted, and ultimately started cracking his facade. Perhaps Bundy's most notorious attack was the Chi Omega sorority house incident in Tallahassee, Florida. On January 15th of 1978, in a late-night frenzy, Bundy broke in to a sorority house and bludgeoned and strangled 4 sleeping women, killing 2 and badly injuring 2 others, all within the span of about 15 minutes. Keep that in mind. As we go into this case more and more, the trial is happening in August. I'm talking about Bryan Kohberger. Keep some of those things in mind. Bundy then slipped away into the night and within a month had abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl in Florida. These Florida crimes led to his final arrest in February of 1978. Forensic evidence in Bundy's cases varied. In the Chi Omega murders, a crucial piece was a bite mark left on a victim's body. A forensic odontologist matched it to Bundy's teeth, convincing the jury of his guilt. I just want to say that kind of evidence is not so reliable these days, but such evidence, along with eyewitness accounts and Bundy's own incriminating behavior during the trial, acting as his own attorney, which led to many outbursts and odd decisions, secured his convictions. Bundy's criminal trajectory also included dramatic escapes from custody. In 1977, while facing murder charges in Colorado, he jumped from a courthouse library window and fled, only to be recaptured days later. And shortly after, he engineered a second escape from a jail by sawing through a ceiling light fixture and crawling out, and then went on to commit the Florida murders while a fugitive. This pattern of bold action under pressure underscores Bundy's personality. He's audacious, he's opportunistic, and he's unrepentant. Ultimately, his crime spree ended with multiple convictions and death sentences. Bundy's known murders spanned roughly 1974 to 1978, ending when he was 32 years old. But the shadow of additional victims looms over his legacy, and he was executed in 1989, having never fully accounting for all the lives that he took. And now shifting gears, Let's compare Bryan Kohberger's criminal trajectory. It is far shorter and more singular than Bundy's. He's accused of a single yet shocking criminal episode, a mass murder of 4 University of Idaho students in the early hours of November 13th, 2022. I said that I thought Bryan's birthday was significant. Is there a possibility that there's a connection with the address that he chose and also the month and year that he chose to commit these murders? They were killed November of 2022, so 11/22. The address of the home was 1122 Kings Road. This may or may not be significant, but I will focus on details like this because it really intrigues me to think about them. I've always thought that was really odd, like it was a gift to himself. It's not unheard of for killers to have little personal meanings behind their crimes. Unlike Bundy's series of crimes over years, Kohberger's known alleged crime occurred all in one night, a spree killing in one single location. According to investigators and an affidavit released by police, Kohberger carefully planned and stalked his targets in advance. Cell phone records and surveillance footage indicate that in the weeks leading up to the murders, a phone linked to Kohberger's number was detected in the vicinity of the victim's residence in Moscow. On at least 12 occasions, mostly in the late evening or early morning, and this suggested he cased the home and established the occupants' patterns, much like a predator studying his prey. It's alleged that Kohberger, armed with a knife, entered the off-campus house sometime around 4 a.m. on November 13th. The victims, 3 young women who lived there, Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Xana Kernodle, and one of the women's visiting boyfriend who did not live there, Ethan Chapin. And the victims were likely asleep or caught off guard in their bedrooms when the killer struck. The murder weapon is believed to be a fixed-blade, combat-style 7-inch knife, a K-bar, used to stab the victims multiple times in a quick, frenzied attack. 2 other female roommates in the house were mysteriously spared and reportedly did not witness the killings. One of them did see a masked figure dressed in black pass by her in the hallway that night, whom she described as having bushy eyebrows, a description that would later raise eyebrows, so to speak, once Kohberger was arrested. Several elements of Kohberger's purported method point to a mix of planning and risk. Some experts say that he chose the house because it was an easy target, a large, somewhat isolated rental home, often frequented by college students that would go in and out with an unlocked door. Kohberger allegedly parked his car, a white Hyundai Elantra, nearby, and then slipped into the house in the pre-dawn hours. The crime was brutal but brief. By 4:20 a.m., surveillance videos captured a white sedan speeding away from the neighborhood. Investigators believe the killer left behind a crucial piece of evidence. A knife sheath was found on the bed near Maddie Mogan's body, and on that sheath's snap fastener was DNA that later was matched to Bryan Kohberger's profile. This forensic link was obtained via genetic genealogy and later direct DNA comparison, and it is central to this case. Other evidence includes the security camera footage tracing the suspect's vehicle route and the cell phone data that places Kohberger's phone traveling from Pullman, Washington, where he lived, to Moscow, Idaho, where the murders occurred, and then back in the early morning hours. There's also the disturbing discovery that after the killings, Kohberger apparently returned to the crime scene around 9 o'clock in the morning. And this is according to his phone pings. Perhaps out of morbid curiosity, maybe to see if the police were responding. This is a behavior that's not uncommon in criminals who feel compelled to revisit the scene, see what's going on. Kohberger's alleged criminal conduct also included attempts to cover his tracks. He drove across the country from Washington to Pennsylvania with his dad a month later, possibly intending to stay with family as the investigation unfolded. While en route, he was pulled over not once but twice, once in Indiana for a traffic violation driving the same white Elantra that police had identified as a vehicle of interest. And at the time, officers had no idea they had briefly stopped a murder suspect, and he was let go with warnings. Kohberger was ultimately arrested on December 30th of 2022 in a raid on his parents' home in Pennsylvania, suggesting the police tracked him through the car and DNA evidence. Unlike Bundy, Kohberger did not, as far as we know, commit a series of escalating prior offenses like kidnappings or sexual assaults leading up to the murders. He has no known criminal record apart from a minor infraction, and if he is guilty, it appears like he went from a law-abiding citizen to committing a quadruple homicide. That's actually atypical. Most serial killers build from lesser crimes up to more intense crimes. So this has led to theories that perhaps this wasn't meant to be a one-off crime. Some experts wonder if Kohberger would have killed again had he not been caught so quickly, or if he had fantasized about murder for a long period before he finally acted. His criminology education might have armed him with a knowledge of forensic techniques, but in practice, the killer still left behind a crucial piece of evidence: DNA and also the phone pings. However, Bryan actually applied, as I mentioned, for an internship as a research assistant for public safety position at the Pullman Police Department in Washington in April of 2022. Kohberger submitted an application with the Pullman Police Department, and in his application essay, he expressed interest in assisting rural law enforcement agencies in better collecting and analyzing technological data in public safety operations. And Bryan Kohberger was actually interviewed for this internship position by the then chief of the Pullman Police Department, Gary Jenkins. This exchange between Kohberger and Chief Jenkins was actually documented in emails that were obtained by the New York Times. In his emails to Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Kohberger wrote, quote, "It was a great pleasure to meet you today and share thoughts and excitement," end quote. Mr. Jenkins then replied that it was, quote, "great to meet and talk with you as well," end quote. Bryan did not get the position, and what this position focused on was collecting and analyzing data in public safety operations, which significantly enhances efficiency, effectiveness, and overall safety. It enables agencies to predict and prevent crime, improve response times, allocate resources effectively, and build stronger community relationships. What Bryan wanted to do was use his expertise to help the police department understand how to best collect things like data from surveillance cameras, body-worn cameras, real-time data from various sources such as social media and 911 calls, and other sources that can provide crucial evidence for investigations and prosecutions. Isn't that interesting? I guess he will now be telling his defense the best measures for excluding that type of evidence and reverse engineering it. Was this a game to him to see if he could commit the perfect crime? Around the same time that he applied for this internship, Bryan was also doing a research project to understand how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. This is true. He asked people on Reddit to answer a survey. He wrote, quote, "This study seeks to understand the story behind your most recent criminal offense with an emphasis on your thoughts and feelings throughout your experience," end quote. Isn't that interesting? Maybe he wanted to experience this on his own, for himself. The survey included questions such as, did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point. Why did you choose that victim or target over others? After committing the crime, what were you thinking and feeling? These questions were designed to delve into the cognitive and emotional processes of an individual during their criminal activities. The survey was part of Kohberger's academic research and was actually approved by DeSales University and their Institute Review Board. And it was conducted under the supervision of faculty members, including Dr. Michelle Bolger, who is listed as the principal investigator. Now, it's important to note that academic research into criminal behavior is a common practice in criminology and psychology programs. However, the context surrounding Kohberger's case has led to an increased scrutiny of his academic work. His phone records allegedly show that in September of 2022, just a couple months prior to the crime, he was Googling things like sociopathic traits in college student and can psychopaths behave prosocially? So it begs the question, was he concerned with his own feelings and trying to figure out if he could function normally? And when he realized that maybe he wouldn't be able to, did he decide to carry out revenge? To pay back those who didn't take him seriously, the professors who removed him as a TA because his standards were too rigid, the women who rejected him, the cops who refused to give him an internship. Was he motivated to show them how smart and scary he could really be? And perhaps claiming fame like his favorite serial killer, Ted Bundy, because he allegedly obsessively researched Ted following the murders. Maybe he was hoping that his name would be as well known. The hoodie selfie that was on my thumbnail and released by Dateline was said to have emulated Ted Bundy on cover art that's on a thumbnail here on YouTube. Then he even watched a Dr. Grande video where Dr. Grande was comparing the Idaho murders to Ted Bundy's Chi Omega murders. he watched that video. So did that begin his obsession, or was it something else? Then there was this interesting piece of information about Bryan's mother, Marianne. She wrote an article about Ted Bundy that was published on February 16th of 1989 following his execution. The title was Cheering the Hearse. She wrote, quote, "Perhaps one of the saddest commentaries on mankind was evident during the execution of Theodore Bundy. While no sane, compassionate individual would excuse the atrocities committed by this man, neither would any sane individual applaud the passing of his funeral hearse. What have we become? Is the taking of a human life acceptable when the state takes responsibility for it?" End quote. It would appear that Marianne was against the death penalty. What irony, as her son is now fighting not to be put to death if he's guilty of these crimes. Marianne also wrote about abortion on April 7th of 2008 in an online article for the Poconos Record, where she was a staff writer at the time. She wrote a piece entitled, "Political Stereotypes Often Do Not Apply." She wrote, quote, "I would like to respond to the general misconception often represented on this page that all Democrats support abortion rights. I do not personally support abortion, and by all means do not support the death penalty. State-sanctioned murder is still just that, murder. Oddly enough, those very individuals who decry a woman's right to choose fully support the death of innocent soldiers in a war based on lies. Those of us against the war are often labeled unpatriotic, or worse yet, stupid. Often contributors of this page are very selective in their morality. It would seem that some believe they have the divine power to tell others what to think. Furthermore, it is arrogant to stereotype people into one group, one that supports the specific political viewpoint. That Marine motto Semper Fi can be said by all who love this country, not just a select few." End quote. So not only is she against the death penalty, but also abortion. And then in 2022, again, Marianne had something to say about death. This time it was in response to the Uvalde, Texas school shooting. At the time, Marianne was a substitute teacher, and she wrote another article in the Poconos Record entitled, "I Pray We Consider the Children Before the Gun." She wrote, quote, "As I sat this morning reeling from yet another school shooting, I found myself wrestling with which actions need to be taken to stop all the madness. What is the answer? Gun control measures? Mental health intervention?" Then I received a message from my daughter, who works as a mental health therapist in New Jersey. She shared a poem that she had written. While in the greatest depths of despair, it shook me to my core, and I felt I need to share it. The poem, which was written by her 31-year-old daughter, Melissa Kohberger, read, quote, "Bereft of their laughter, there is now not a sound, as we lower our children into the ground, small hands and feet buried 6 feet deep into the earth of the world that failed them." End quote. The poem was written on May 24th of 2022, and Marianne's article about it was written on June 2nd, just months before the 4 college students would be stabbed to death in their home, and her son would be charged with their murders. It was late December, 6 weeks after the murders, that Bryan used his phone to watch that YouTube video called Ted Bundy, The Essence of a Psychopath. Then he took 2 selfies of himself in a black hoodie, just like the AI picture of Ted Bundy that was on this thumbnail. Was it a coincidence? I mean, Ted Bundy didn't really look like that, but perhaps the YouTube video inspired Bryan. Bundy was 27 when he first started killing, and Bryan was 27 as well, just 8 days shy of turning 28. Was there something to that? He also looked up a Britney Spears song called Criminal, and he listened to a slower, more eerie version with the lyrics, "He is a villain by the devil's law. He's a killer just for fun, fun, fun. That man's a snitch and unpredictable. He's got no conscience. He's got none, 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 none." Was this Bryan being drawn to this song because he was now a criminal? Or maybe it was for his research, because now he knew what it felt like and what actions a criminal would take and what they feel like after the crime, just like he was asking Redditors to tell him about for his project. According to Dateline, his phone was allegedly used to search for adult material along with terms like passed out, forced, drugged, and sleeping around the November 2022 murders. Kohberger's alleged criminal trajectory is that of an aspiring predator who struck in a singular, highly violent event. Now, the methods: stealth, intrusion at night, use of a knife on sleeping victims, no obvious personal connection to the victims. This all suggested a cold-blooded intent to kill just for the sake of killing, rather than a rage or for profit. And unlike Bundy, who was definitively proven guilty, Bryan Kohberger remains legally presumed innocent pending his trial. However, all the evidence outlined by authorities does paint a pretty chilling picture of a calculated mass murder in the making, a serial killer in the making. Now, what about the media portrayals for both of these men? For Ted Bundy, his case was arguably the first media frenzy around a serial killer in the United States. His 1979 trial in Miami for the Chi Omega sorority murders was nationally televised, which was a novelty back then. And it turned Bundy into a dark celebrity. What do you think of that? A lot of people are comparing this to Karen Reed and how she has become kind of a celebrity overnight with her trial. The media and the public were struck by the dichotomy between Bundy's polished image and then his horrific deeds. Newspapers described him as charming, clean-cut, a former law student, emphasizing how normal or even appealing he seemed on the surface. This narrative of the boy next door who was secretly a monster was very compelling, and it got extensive coverage. Indeed, Bundy played into this image. In court, he would act as his own attorney, like I mentioned, addressing the court and the jury confidently, even smiling or winking. And reporters noted how he exuded self-confidence in the courtroom, even smiling at those who were watching in the audience. And shockingly, his murder trial had a steady stream of female spectators, young women who flocked to the courtroom, some dressed just like his victims had dressed. Tell me what you think of that. And some admitted they were mesmerized by Bundy's magnetism. Media outlets did stories on these Bundy groupies, which further led to the infamy of Ted Bundy. One reporter at the trial quoted a teenage girl that was in the gallery saying, quote, "He's fascinating. He just has a kind of magnetism," end quote. This was a man on trial for viciously killing women just like her. This aspect of the media portrayal has been debated. Some felt the coverage risked almost glamorizing him by focusing on his looks and his intellect rather than how savage his crimes were. And at the same time, the media certainly covered all of the gruesome details and the fear that this man evoked. In cities like Seattle or Salt Lake City, the headlines in the mid-1970s warned women not to go out alone, as unknown perpetrators, later identified as Bundy, were abducting co-eds. Once Bundy was caught and identified, his name and face was everywhere. The fact that he managed to kill across so many states raised public criticism of law enforcement and their coordination. And even after his convictions, Bundy continued to be in the media spotlight throughout the 1980s as he appealed his death sentences. He gave high-profile interviews from death row, most famously a final interview to evangelical broadcaster James Dobson the night before his execution, an interview in which Bundy, seemingly manipulative till the end, claimed that pornography was the root of his violence. The interview was broadcast widely, stirring the media discussion about the causes of violence, even decades after his death.
One of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
Again, I know that people will accuse me of being self-serving, but we're beyond that now. I mean, I'm just telling you how I feel. But through God's help, I have been able to come to the point where much too late, but better late than never, feel the hurt and the pain that I am responsible for. And I can only hope that those who I've harmed, those who I've caused so much grief, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence.
Bundy's story remains a media fixture. I mean, we're talking about it right now. Numerous documentaries, true crime series, books, and films have been made about him. Even in recent years, Netflix released Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. And then there was the film that was released in 2019 entitled Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile, which reignited the public's fascination with Ted Bundy. There was even social media chatter from some viewers that were disturbingly swooning over Bundy's perceived attractiveness, prompting media outlets to remind the public not to romanticize a serial killer. The media's portrayal of Bundy swings between acknowledging the horror of his acts and dissecting the perverse charisma that he would project. He's been labeled in the press as handsome, brilliant, and evil incarnate. But maybe one of the best summaries came from a retrospective piece. Quote, "He was a mass killer who on the surface seemed among America's finest young men. The boy next door yearned to kill the girls next door and made him seem both ironic and demonic." And that was written by Los Angeles Times. The media made Bundy an infamous household name, a paradoxical figure of fear and a dark allure in the public's imagination. But what about Bryan Kohberger? The media portrayal of Bryan is still evolving. It has been extensive and intense from the moment that he was named a suspect, which I think could be a problem. The Idaho quadruple murders garnered nationwide headlines even before any arrest had occurred. The randomness and the brutality of this crime in a college town fueled weeks and weeks of speculation in late 2022. People were glued to their phones, to the TV, to any information they could get. And once Kohberger was arrested in December of 2022, media coverage kicked into overdrive. A key theme in coverage has been the eerie parallels and contrast between Kohberger and notorious killers like Bundy. Social media, internet sleuths, and the media itself immediately drew comparisons, noting that both were educated men. Kohberger, a PhD student, Bundy, a former law student, and that Kohberger's mugshot even resembled Bundy's smirk in some photos. Headlines highlighted Kohberger's criminology background. It made for a morbidly fascinating narrative that someone who studied crime might have executed one so heinous. For instance, major newspapers and TV broadcasts reported on how Kohberger studied under a serial killer expert, and had even posted that survey online, seeking input about criminals and how they felt committing their crimes. This detail painted Kohberger as someone uncomfortably interested in the psyche of murderers. They've also focused on Kohberger's persona, like with the words awkward, isolated, and loner appearing frequently based on interviews with former classmates and friends. And unlike Bundy, who courted the cameras, Kohberger has mostly remained silent and expressionless in his courtroom appearances, leading some to characterize him as cold or being stoic. Some of the coverage has fixated on his body language during pretrial hearings, for example, noting that he has a dead-eyed stare and speculating what it might say about his psychology. Local and national outlets have also covered the mystery angle heavily. Since Kohberger has not made any public statements about the crime, media discussion is often focused on the unanswered question of why and what was the motive. This has opened a space for a lot of speculation, and that is to be expected. There are people that are theorizing that Kohberger might have been motivated by rejection or the incel-type hatred, while others wonder if he wanted to test himself against his academic knowledge, in a twisted sense of committing the perfect crime, as I have stated. The case gag order has limited official information, so the media has relied on leaks and anonymous sources. People and NBC have reported leaked details like Kohberger's allegedly having photos of the victims on his phone and searches on his computer and phone of Ted Bundy, and like I mentioned, adult material. I think it's also worth noting that the Kohberger case has also played out heavily on social media and the internet early on. There were amateur sleuths flooding Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube with theories, some true, many of them, of course, false. And this forced mainstream media to sometimes have to debunk these rumors. For instance, false claims about Kohberger posting on a victim's Instagram account after the murders. And mainstream coverage has been more restrained than the internet free-for-all. But the sheer volume of interest meant that every court document and hearing has been live tweeted, analyzed in real time on lives with YouTubers, people like me, And the media also covered the fear and the relief in the community. Before Kohberger was arrested, the unsolved murders, they're still kind of unsolved since he hasn't been adjudicated yet, but they terrified Moscow, Idaho. Students were fleeing the campus. They were buying deadbolt locks for their doors. And after the arrest, reporters captured the relief that the residents and the students felt. The media portrayal of Bryan Kohberger has cast him as a potentially calculating killer, hiding in his academia, often explicitly paralleling him with infamous figures like Ted Bundy. I think many could say they've heard of Bryan Kohberger, so he has somewhat become a household name because of the media scrutiny and coverage. And his trial this year in August is expected to be another major media event, with social media and the press dissecting every reaction and, of course, sadly, the gruesome evidence, just like they did with Bundy decades ago. Now, what about the public and legal responses? Well, for Ted Bundy, his reign of terror provoked widespread public fear and later public rejoicing at his capture and punishment. During the mid-1970s, when women were disappearing in Washington, Utah, and Colorado, communities were gripped with panic. Young women actually purchased guns. They changed their hairstyles. Many stopped parting their hair down the middle. The look Bundy seemed to target at the time, and they avoided going out alone at night. The public pressure on law enforcement was immense. It led to one of the first multi-state task forces to track a serial killer. And once Bundy was finally arrested and identified in 1978, the relief was significant, but it was far from over. His legal proceedings spanned multiple states and years. Bundy was tried first in Utah for aggravated kidnapping a surviving victim, then extradited to Colorado, from where he escaped custody, and ultimately tried in Florida for murder. But the legal response to Bundy set precedents at the time. His 1979 Florida trial was the first trial ever televised nationally in the United States, giving the public a front row seat. And prosecutors in Florida sought and obtained the death penalty not once, but 3 times, for 2 murders in the Chi Omega case and for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in a separate trial. Bundy was very confident and he acted as his own attorney. Of course he did. And in hindsight, this was a legal strategy that was a disaster for him. It turned the courtroom into a high drama scenario. He cross-examined witnesses. He even gave a closing argument and interrogated character witnesses during the penalty phase. It was very bizarre and a big spectacle. I told you that after conviction, Bundy used every legal maneuver available to delay his execution. He appealed his convictions through the state and federal appeals court. He alleged technical errors and even took his case to the Supreme Court, which of course denied him. And as his execution date got closer and closer in the late 1980s, Bundy attempted to barter information about unsolved murders in exchange for a stay of execution, a ploy that the Florida authorities resisted, not wanting to reward his manipulations and give him what he wanted. And finally, on January 24th of 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. And the public reaction was extraordinary. Over 500 people gathered outside the prison, and they were cheering when the lights flickered, which signaled the execution had happened. They were chanting, "Burn, Bundy, burn," in celebration. Some even set off fireworks and banged pots and pans, treating his death as a moment of justice for the nation. At the time, it was one of the largest and most boisterous crowds ever assembled for an execution in the United States. And it just reflected how notorious Bundy had become. And at the same time, a few voices in the crowd and the media urged reflection on all of this. This was an execution of a man that did really disgusting and brutal things. It wasn't a football game. So there was a lot of scrutiny on the way people were reacting. Legally, Bundy's case had a significant impact. It spurred improvements in interstate cooperation on violent serial killers. His ability to kill in multiple states taught the FBI and local police the need for a centralized database, which eventually led to systems like VICAP, which is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. It also influenced how trials were covered. Bundy's TV coverage foreshadowed later cases like O.J. Simpson's. The Bundy case validated the effectiveness of criminal profiling. FBI profilers had created one of the first profiles for the Ted killer in the 1970s, which Bundy eerily matched. And in the end, both the public and the legal system were resolute. Bundy was to be held accountable. His execution was seen by many as a rightful conclusion, and even law enforcement officers who were there said that Bundy died much more humanely than his victims had. But what about Bryan Kohberger? The public and legal response to the Idaho murders, and Kohberger's arrest has been massive, though it's still unfolding right now. Initially, the public in Moscow, Idaho, and nationwide, as the case made the news, was terrified by the brutality and randomness of these murders. For 7 weeks, from mid-November 2022 until his arrest in December 2022, there was widespread anxiety and frustration at the lack of a suspect. Students fled campus, they stayed home, they carried pepper spray, and the internet sleuths were swarming social media with their investigations. When Kohberger's name was announced as a suspect, the focus shifted to who is this person? How did police find him? And the revelation came: DNA, modern forensic genealogy, that played a role in identifying Kohberger, and it reassured many that the investigation was strong and the evidence was strong. The legal documentation outlining probable cause was detailed. The DNA on the sheath, the surveillance of a car like Kohberger's, the cell phone records. This was widely made public. Everyone was looking at it, giving the public an unusual level of insight into a case against him. Legally, Bryan Kohberger was extradited from Pennsylvania to Idaho to face 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In Idaho, he obtained a public defender experienced in capital cases. This is Ann Taylor. Kohberger made an initial appearance where the charges were read, and notably, according to some accounts, he was calm, and he just stood there and said he understood, even looking forward to being exonerated, as one report put it. The judge had to issue a sweeping gag order to prevent attorneys, law enforcement, and others from speaking with the media about the details. And this is in order to protect Kohberger's right to a fair trial, given the saturation of the coverage. And this gag order was challenged by the media outlets, but it was upheld. Due to the enormous pretrial publicity in the small community of Moscow, the court decided to move the trial to a different venue in Boise, over 300 miles away, to get a more impartial jury pool. The state of Idaho, through its prosecutors, announced they would seek the death penalty against Bryan Kohberger if he is convicted. They cited the heinous, multiple victim nature of this crime, and Idaho recently brought back the option of an execution by firing squad as a fallback method, and this just shows how seriously they approach these potential capital cases. Bryan Kohberger's defense, meanwhile, has hinted at possible strategies. For instance, they filed a motion suggesting an intention to present an alibi, claiming he was out driving alone the night of the murders, possibly stargazing. Yes, they said that. And then there was an intriguing defense motion about Kohberger having autism spectrum disorder, possibly to argue against the death penalty, if it comes to that. Public response to Kohberger's arrest was one of relief, but also curiosity. Some of the victims' families have been very vocal, praising law enforcement, but also giving their criticism as well. Because this case hasn't gone to trial, there are so many questions and people want answers. Motive, details of the crime. Kohberger's family also issued a public statement expressing condolences to the victim's family, but also asserting Kohberger's presumption of innocence. A lot of people have been very fast to say that Bryan Kohberger is 100% guilty, but there are others that caution against a rush to judgment, at least until all the evidence is heard. That being said, public sentiment in Moscow and among true crime followers heavily leans towards believing in Kohberger's guilt, given the evidence that has already been exposed or disclosed. There are also those who just don't think he did it, and they have been dubbed pro-burgers. Let me know if you have a theory or a perspective on this case. When the trial commences, currently expected in August of this year, 2025, it will be a huge public event. I will be doing some live streams here on this channel talking about the case. Don't know if I'm going to be doing like full day live streams, but it's most likely going to be live streamed in court. And because of that, they have talked about beefing up security in the courtroom. And there's also a lot of preparation for managing crowds of media and also people just standing outside. The legal impact that this case has had already demonstrates the power of investigative genetic genealogy in high-profile cases, using a DNA sample and tracing it to relatives, a method that was first made famous in the Golden State Killer case. It may set a precedent in how such evidence is challenged or accepted in court. The database used is not deemed illegal, but it had been suggested by the FBI not to be used for legal investigative purposes. It's the MyHeritage database. I'm in there too. My family's in there. And in Bryan Kohberger's case, it highlights a lot of pretrial publicity, the change of venue, the gag order. This is all about the tension between an open public interest and a fair trial. The fact that there are full-on documentaries put on by Dateline, for example, before a trial has even happened, it is concerning. I understand the public's desire for information, but I almost feel like that's unheard of in many other cases. But recently, it's becoming the norm. It's the hunger that the public has for knowledge. Also, the University of Idaho murders prompted the campus to reevaluate their safety measures, and it also ignited discussions on victims' rights and support for surviving roommates and the victims' families. The societal response to Bryan Kohberger's alleged crimes has been one of horror, but also of collective resolve to see justice done in the court. And legally, the system is moving methodically. An indictment by a grand jury, a plea of not guilty by Kohberger, and a scheduled trial where a jury will have to decide his fate, possibly between life imprisonment or death. The contrast with Bundy's time is notable because today's public is consuming every legal filing in real time on the internet, whereas Bundy's era was all newspapers and nightly news. But in both cases, the public and legal response demonstrate how deeply a brutal crime can scar a community and how determined society is to hold the perpetrator accountable. Until this information was leaked, I do see the similarities in the way that he looks compared to Ted Bundy. Like, maybe people think that Bryan Kohberger's handsome, the blue eyes, the cheekbones, the facial structure. Maybe. In case you didn't catch all the similarities, I want to go over them now. They both went to college in Washington. They both got degrees in psychology. They were both 27 when they killed for the first time. They both killed in Idaho. Ted and Bryan were highly intelligent and pursuing advanced degrees when they were caught. Ted and his law degree, and Bryan with his PhD in criminology. They were both interested in the law or law enforcement, and they were objectively handsome, but both bullied as children. But what about their killings? Bundy attempted to kill 4 sleeping women in a sorority house, killing 2 and badly injuring the other 2 within 15 minutes. Bryan Kohberger allegedly entered that off-campus house where the 4 college women lived. Kaylee had just moved out at the time. So did he too plan to kill 4 sleeping women and didn't expect Ethan Chapin to be there? All 3 women that were killed that night were in sororities. One surviving roommate, Bethany Funk, was also in a sorority. The killing was carried out in as little as approximately 13 minutes. So was that a record that he was trying to break? Ted's record? Could Bryan Kohberger have been inspired by Ted Bundy? Sure. If he is the killer, maybe that's true. But I would like your thoughts. If you did like this comparison and you want me to do more, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much for being here today. I will see you in my next video. Bye.